Okay, so I think we'll just get going and make a start. We've got quite a busy agenda today. Okay, so on behalf of everyone at the Centre for Climate Justice, it's both an honour and a huge pleasure to welcome you all to this, our fourth online public engagement event, which we're running today in partnership with Chatham House and Sembo Scotland. I know that we have participants from all parts of the world, so again, a huge welcome wherever you're joining us from, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tassine Jaffrey and I'm the Director of the Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University. Our focus is putting front and centre not only difficult and challenging conversations, but rather clear scientific evidence and insights on the impact of climate change on people and society from an injustice perspective. We provide education on climate justice via our unique Master's Climate Justice programme, and we're home to a growing number of climate justice doctoral students. Our event today, Climate Justice and Recovery Post-COVID-19, Social and Racial Inequality, has come to fruition as a result of the gathering of minds on current issues facing humanity right now. Climate change, the coronavirus pandemic, Black Lives Matter. The Centre, Chatham House and Sembo Scotland are all organisations individually working on these issues, but collectively we naturally came together to brainstorm current trends and thinking and to consider what more needs to be done to ensure that recovery packages are bold, ambitious and have a clear mandate that takes care of all of society, not just the few. So on to our event this afternoon, we will be joined by three fantastic speakers. First of all, Senan Matter, who works with me at the Centre as a postdoctoral researcher. His specialisms straddle working on climate migration and displacement, as well as energy and just transition. Together with myself, we will provide the context to this event and in terms of what is fair and just. We will then hear from Patrick Schroeder, who will unpack this context further. Patrick will be providing us with his thoughts on international efforts to build resilient societies, touching on issues such as green jobs, taxation, debt relief, poverty and inequality. Patrick is a Senior Research Fellow of the Energy, Environment and Resources Programme at Chatham House. The focus of his research is to connect the circular economy discourse with the Sustainable Development Goals and human development objectives. Before moving to the UK in 2015, Patrick was based in Beijing, where he worked with the China Civil Action Network. Zarina Ahmed will conclude the presentations and dig deeper into the issues of race inequality with reference to representation. Zarina's work combines equalities and climate change, and she has been working for more than 10 years to ensure there is more engagement and voice from the ethnic minority sector, and more recently through the creation of the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network. These presentations will be followed by a Q&A session moderated by Michael Mikulovic, who's a research fellow and works with me at the Centre for Climate Justice. So I think without further ado, we can begin with the first of the presentations. Okay, so climate justice, COVID-19 and recovery strategies. The coronavirus has caused huge social and economic disruption. So I would like to start by asking a question. What does this mean for combating the crisis of human-induced climate change? The slowdown in economic growth has seen the price of American crude oil turn negative as demand has fallen. Less travel but reductions in industrial activity has resulted in global carbon emissions falling. By mid-March, CO2 emissions had reduced by 17% compared with 2019 averages. However, these respites have come at a significant human cost. Unemployment is rising, companies are laying off workers and struggling to stay in business, and healthcare systems are struggling to cope with the scale of the pandemic. This is more profound in the developing world, which is not possible to social distance and have access to clean water for hand washing. And this is compounded by climate change and extreme weather events, floods and droughts impacting people's resilience to adapt to their environment and their personal circumstances. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, stressed that we do not forget the deeper environmental emergency of climate change during our response to coronavirus. As we enter easing of lockdown and the rebooting of economies all around the world, carbon emissions are expected to significantly outstrip the carbon reduction gains accumulated thus far. So a return to business as usual, escalating climate change and further exposing the most vulnerable to the ensuing impacts are clear. And I will hand over to Senan to go through an example of this. Senan, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks, Tessie. One way climate change and COVID are connected is through food security. The lockdown measures have restricted the movement of agricultural labour and goods, and the UN is concerned this will lead to global food shortages. At the same time, climate change through increasingly erratic and extreme weather is undermining food systems by damaging crops and decreasing productivity. In fact, the goal to achieve zero hunger by 2030 is now in doubt. 690 million people went hungry in 2019, and this was an increase of 100 million people from the previous year. But this burden is not felt equally. It is the poorest and the most vulnerable within society, as well as many developing nations, who will most keenly feel the impact of food insecurity because of climate change and because of these far-reaching effects of COVID-19 on global food systems and transportation networks. But I'm certainly happy to discuss some of these other examples later this afternoon.
Okay, thanks for that, Senan. So the first part of the message is clear. It is about recognising that social inequality exists, and moreover that climate inequality exists, and placing these issues at the core of recovery packages we see as absolutely critical. And this is where the issue of justice or injustice comes in, and recognising that the poorest who have contributed least to carbon emissions suffer the most, and it is also the same group who are affected most by the pandemic. It is the poorest who live in the poorest neighbourhoods, overcrowded settlements, and so on. And it is important that moving on, we use transformative approaches to tackle the climate crisis through this justice lens. How we do that is placing procedural and distributive justice at the heart of recovery frameworks. That means allowing citizens to participate in decision-making processes and ensuring that the costs and benefits of the transition are distributed fairly. When it comes to building back better, the real test will be whether the world's governments are willing to adopt new approaches to economic management that recognises social and climate inequalities. Much of this is dependent on financing being available. And we know that NDCs are conditional to international funding becoming not only available, but also accessible, particularly for the poorest nations. The worry is that NDCs are being recalculated and reassessed to be not as ambitious prior to COVID, as the money is simply not there for neither mitigation or adaptation measures. In the last few days, we have been hearing of the new EU recovery deal that has just been approved by EU heads of state. Some say that the good news is that there is a deal, which is great. However, the bad news is that there will be cuts to climate programmes, which leads me to the next question, is where do priorities lie? I have to say that I do not have answers to all of this particular question in terms of where priorities lie for governments and states, but I will say that what we need to do is to continue to be radical and ambitious in our thinking and pushing forward with and embracing issues of inclusivity, voice, representation and participation. For me, the thinking that underpins all of this is to need to work in interdisciplinary partnerships, which I think is something that we just do not do enough of. So with that in mind, I hope I have managed to set the scene and would now like to hand over to Patrick for his presentation and to continue the conversation a bit further.
So yes, good afternoon, welcome everyone. I will continue with my presentation where Tassie and Senan left off. There was a picture of a man holding a sign on the last slide, which was asking where is the funding, where's the finance, and trying to understand the international efforts. I will specifically look at what's happening in terms of finance at the current state. So these are the three main points I'll be talking about: financing green recovery and green jobs, then coordinated global tax reform, and just transition approach for climate and development finance. So with this first question, the first point, I had a look at DevEx, who have set up this tracker, which is very useful. And they are analyzing the amount of funding that's currently being allocated. And in total, there are about 20 trillion US dollars at the moment. And you can see here on the left-hand side, most of this is going to be spent on economic recovery, the largest share, and some has been allocated to the response. You can also see that most of the funding comes from country-specific initiatives. That means national governments having allocated these. The multi-region initiatives are about 20%. And one of the interesting initiatives is the $3 trillion contribution of the IMF towards the Global Clean Energy Initiative. So it'll be very interesting to see how this develops and where the money will be spent in which countries. So however, from this tracker so far, it's not quite clear really to understand what is green, what isn't green, what is climate related, what isn't. So a lot more research needs to be done on this over the next few months, and maybe years even. So I also wanted to mention that the UN General Secretary also highlighted the need that the economic recovery needs to support the green transition and green jobs. So we need to use fiscal firepower to drive a shift from the greater green economy. That's what he said. He made a statement about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, and climate risks and opportunities must be incorporated into the financial system. So there's a clear message from the UN what needs to happen. There's also been recently another report by the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights and Poverty, which is quite crucial, especially in the light of the crisis. The SDGs are failing in relation to key goals such as poverty eradication, economic equality, gender equality, and climate change. So the key message here is that SDGs need to be calibrated in response to COVID, and also linked again to global warming. So already we will see that there will be tens of millions of people who will be pushed again into the extreme poverty through the crisis. And he also very much made the statement that poverty is a political choice and a matter of social justice and climate justice in our context. So one of the recommendations that is also mentioned in the report is that we need to have a coordinated global tax reform to reduce mass avoidance and evasion. This will be a key financing mechanism that can be used to address inequality and social justice, especially developing countries losing a large amount of revenue every year through avoidance. And one of the issues that's running in parallel is about taxing the digital economy and national corporations. So there's a unified approach by the OECD to deal with this, and this will be a key mechanism, I think, to generate additional funding. So I'm just trying to go to the next slide. One of the areas that we're working on in our program is on the circular economy, and one of the areas here is environmental taxation, which is quite an interesting development. Now, in the EU, there are discussions about leveraging a tax on virgin plastics with the aim also to fund or to generate revenue to fund the recovery. So taxation on virgin plastics will not only reduce waste, it will also have climate benefits. So there's multiple wins that can be achieved through this. So the last point I want to make, I think I'm running out of time, is the need to apply just transition principles to both climate and development finance, and also to the COVID-19 recovery. Very interestingly, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development has very recently launched their Just Transition Initiative in 2020. This will be key to ensure that communities and workers will not be negatively affected by the transition to a low carbon economy. And I very much hope that other development banks will also follow suit and apply similar approaches. And to conclude, I just wanted to highlight and let you know about this report that we published a few months ago about promoting a just transition to an inclusive circular economy. So we, in this report, we make the case that we need to have a global mechanism to mobilize dedicated support funds for countries in need, and also transparent and accountable institutions will be crucial to ensure that the funds reach those which are most in need. Please, yes, if you're interested, you can go to this report. There's lots more in there. And I stop here, and I hope we can continue the discussion later.
Great, Patrick, thank you very much for talking us through the links between circular economy, just transitions, and the role of climate finance, all really difficult and challenging conversations, particularly at this time. What I would like to do now is to invite Zarina to provide us with her thoughts on and looking deeper into some of the social and racial inequalities that are involved in these discussions. So Zarina, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tassie. So as we have heard, the recent pandemic has highlighted the existing inequalities in our society. And in order to achieve a truly inclusive post-pandemic recovery, I would like to start questioning the narrative of we are in this together. Are we really in this together? In this current climate, if you're a person from a BME background, it definitely does not feel this way at all. My worry is that we may not be moving forward together at all. Yes, we know with COVID-19, there are a number of underlying factors contributing to these disparities. However, it's gravely shown how in Britain, and of course around the world, the most vulnerable and poorest are not being protected. So, give me a second, try to move this. Right, okay, so looking at recent events, how will these influence any recovery plan? So the coronavirus has created a global pandemic and has morbidly demonstrated that a crisis does not affect us all equally and has highlighted the stark inequalities in society. Recent studies show that BME people in the UK are disproportionately more likely to become critically ill and to die from coronavirus. Black and ethnic minority patients make up 34% of those in intensive care, despite making up only 13% of the population. Scottish Government, surprisingly, have only recently thought it important to carry out their own research, and a report was published 2 weeks ago with their findings. And not surprisingly, there was a disproportionate number of BME people affected by coronavirus here too in Scotland. Black Lives Matter, a global uprising movement demanding racial justice, triggered by the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police, people who we expect to protect us. This was not about one man's death, but many whose lives are not seen as having any worth or value and suffer discrimination at many levels, just simply based on the colour of their skin. Again, highlighting the systemic and institutional racism which exists in our society, the move from no racism to anti-racism has been a catalyst for change, a call for action. Colonialism and slave trade. Holding the West accountable for historical actions which resulted in the exploitation of people of colour, which has caused divisions and structural racism perpetuating over centuries. Many institutes and cities, Glasgow included, have been built on the profit of these people, and now there is a demand for acknowledgement and repatriation of funds. The climate crisis. So attempting to dismantle the drivers of climate change, including fossil fuel industries, is impossible if we do not dismantle the systems that uphold white supremacy built to make a profit off the backs of Black, Brown and Indigenous people. For it is this that has led to climate injustices, racism and the destruction of the planet. And if we look at the way media has reported, and I can use an example of the wildfires in Australia, little coverage was given to the Indigenous people who lost their habitat and homes, whereas white lives were valued over these Indigenous people. Another aspect of climate injustice. Right, so at the centre of the UK recovery plan are economic drivers. Of course, these are important. And how do we get so we have to make considerations on how do we get the country's economy back up and running? How do we avoid businesses closing, concerns regarding unemployment, numbers rising rapidly, etc., etc. However, social recovery also plays an important part of the plan, building better lives, health and well-being, better work-life balance. There is also consideration to green adaptations, move to a net zero, incorporating green infrastructure plans, transport systems, access to green spaces. And there are opportunities for conversations for change by increasing civil participation locally and globally. Right. Alternative recovery proposals with people and well-being at the heart have been put forward, influencing much needed change and have started, and I emphasise this, as much work is still needed, addressing issues of inequality. Right, so we have the Green New Deal, which is a UK-wide proposal. There's the Build Back Better, Just Green Recovery, both UK and Scottish movements. And much more locally, we have the Glasgow Manifesto, which has been submitted to Glasgow City Council. Also, there have been numerous open letters to various ministers and the First Minister demanding specific changes, i.e. good food for all, access to growing spaces, divestment from fossil fuels, etc. Right, so now is the time to go beyond non-discrimination approaches. We need positive action to see systemic changes, both in practices, outcomes and representation. So any recovery plan needs to have a clear, accountable action plan. Looking at some of the key areas which are being considered to help us get to net zero. Right, working from home, a new option, but this is not the case for those in care sector, in NHS, hospitality, retail and food industry, where there is a higher percentage of BME people. Then looking at the transport system. So there's a need to reduce for travel, looking at more public transport and looking at electrifying vehicles. But how accessible are these? How about people on lower incomes? How do they get access? Access to outdoor green spaces. High proportion of BME people lived in built-up urban areas with little or no access to outdoor. So how are they being considered when we're looking at green spaces? And then create new renewable energy skills and jobs. There are already existing inequalities within the employment sector. And there's already concerns on how we ensure that there isn't such a big divide within this employment sector, and that we aren't replicating the same problems again and again. Allocation of funding and resources. We have to be aware that where these resources are being allocated, these resources, the allocation of these resources can further alienate certain groups in society and create further gaps and competition. So, there must be social and climate justice at the heart of the Just Transition Net Zero Recovery Plan, ensuring existing inequalities in society are recognised, addressed and tackled, with vulnerable and marginalised people being protected, equally valued and very much of an inclusive society. So we need to see a transition from a we and you culture, a me and them mindset and the othering attitude. So thank you, and we can carry on this discussion in the breakout sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zarina, for that. And certainly issues of procedural and distributive justice ring right to the core of what you were trying to say there. So really grateful for that. So what I would like to do now is to hand over to Michael, who will be chairing the Q&A session. So Michael, over to you now.
Sure. So I've been monitoring the chat. We have one question so far from Jill Matthews. Jill is asking about conventional economics and how it doesn't work well for the environment. And it's a long question. I'll do my best to synthesize it. So Jill's asking on the issue of the pandemic as an example of the economic cost of the world of not doing business as usual. How do we put the world on a new course where the savings to the planet and society are counted as positive rather than not calculated in bizarre ways? And as an example, she's talking about health and pollution control measures which contribute positively to GDP, whereas they should be counted as negative. So I'm not sure who the question is for, so I guess it's for everyone.
Okay, Michael, thanks for synthesizing that. It's a very, very long question. And I guess from my perspective, it's much comes down to leadership in this crisis that we have with the climate and the pandemic as well. It's putting front and center things that are really going to make a difference to people's lives and livelihoods and quality of life, and embracing issues of rights as well. At the end of the day, everyone is entitled to a decent quality of life, but the way the recovery packages, as I see it, are all stacked up, they all speak through an economic lens. And my concern is issues around health and well-being of society. And I'm not hearing much about the well-being side of the conversation coming through. And for me to push those things and make sure that they're at the heart of these recovery packages does come down to leadership and commitment from governments to back their approaches. If all approaches are just all hanging on the back of economic growth models, then we're not changing where we were 20, 30, 40 years ago in terms of our thinking. So I think we need to find ways in which these things can be embedded into these conversations.
Thanks, Yassine. Zarina, Patrick?
Oh yes, as I understand the question, there are different ways of really calculating. So we've been measuring GDP. I think that was also mentioned in the question. So there are now many discussions about moving away from GDP as the sole indicator of development or well-being. Tassin mentioned it also. So there's what has emerged as a well-being alliance. Scotland, I think, is part of it, which is the way forward. There are also other ways of accounting, for example, ecosystem services, natural capital accounting. So these approaches are quite important, and we probably have an opportunity now to change really the focus of what we measure.
Thanks, Patrick. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yes, so just to add on to what Patrick's saying about the Wellbeing Alliance. So the Wellbeing Alliance have been working in Scotland, the Scottish Government as well, to have a look at putting wellbeing at the heart and measuring well-being as an indicator of how well a country is doing, and moving away from GDP. I read a really interesting book which really opened my eyes to GDP and how GDP is measured around destruction. So how bad a country is doing is actually how well their GDP is. And it's just fundamentally trying to change that perception. And I think the only way we can do that is by putting well-being at the heart, and by putting social justice and looking at all the injustices and putting them as a primary driver and not economic drivers.
Thanks, Zarina. We got the questions are actually coming in higher numbers now, so if you can ask the speakers to keep their responses relatively short to make sure that we can address all of them. So we've got a question from Gary Cass. Do we have a widely agreed set of metrics by which we can observe and track the transitions? What specific metrics might we use to track the justness of these transitions? So maybe Patrick, would you like to start this one?
Yes, that's a tough one. I don't think I have an answer, and I don't think we have indicators yet. Well, just maybe new initiative by the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Within their Just Transition initiative, they have now included indicators to measure the impact of their investments and their finance, which includes also impacts on communities and job creation, quality of jobs, these types of indicators. And I think that's a good start.
Thanks, Patrick. Tassine?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Patrick. I think the development of these indicators is probably really needed, but like I mentioned in my presentation, rather disappointingly, that we're hearing from the Green Deals, that one of the biggest fallouts from the European recovery package rather than Green Deal is the impact it's going to make on research going forward. So again, one of my huge worries is the underlying research and development that's needed to support the development of some of these indicators going forward.
And Zarina?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that as well, that I think it's something that needs to be developed and looked at. And but also within that development, the worrying part is that the resources are going to be pulled from those areas. But also is when that development is happening and the research is happening, I think people really have to be at the heart of that. So again, it's about where do we put those resources and where do we put that time and effort? It needs to be considered if we're to develop it well.
Great, thank you, Zarina. The next question is for Patrick from David Smith. What are the main international law reforms needed to support some of the taxation options you outlined?
Okay, that's also a difficult one, and I'm not a legal expert. However, I can maybe say that a lot of legal work is needed. This is something, so the digital economy has developed very quickly without having sufficient legal frameworks in place. I think I might have to leave it here. So I mentioned in terms of the taxation aspect, I mentioned the OECD initiative there. There's also many national initiatives underway. But I'm happy to keep in touch on this, and we can take this offline if you want to discuss this further.
Good. Thanks, Patrick. We've got another question from Jenny Patient. trade unions share many of the values set out here about equality and justice in work and economics. They are the largest social movement in the UK. How can they become allies on climate justice in building back better? Zarina, would you like to start that one?
Yeah, I can start with that one. I think we're starting to build more, like we as in the climate justice movement are trying to start build up better relationships with the unions, the trade unions. I think one of the biggest issues with trade unions has always been historically about jobs and about employment. And I think it's trying to move away, well, not move away, but trying to understand that jobs and employment is all about climate injustice. So I think there is now a chance of, especially during COVID, of highlighting inequalities and a place for the unions to be and to represent the voices of those underrepresented. It's becoming stronger and stronger. So I think the time for unions to build allies is the best time now for them to get involved, yes. But I think it's to recognise that climate justice will have an impact on jobs.
Good, thank you. Tassim?
Yeah, just to echo what Zarina's saying, but also I think there's a huge opportunity out there for unions to be part of critical conversations that are taking place at all levels within different platforms. And I think the power is in the voice, because there's a lot of weight that's carried behind that. And I think what we're seeing is the governments have, the UK government has embraced conversations through citizens' assemblies, for example. But I think what we need to do is find ways of ensuring that those doors are open to trade unions, and to encourage those climate kind of like conversations to take place, and not to be afraid of the challenges that are posed from different platforms, from the trade unions, whether being a social movement or not. I think now is the time to be able to embrace these conversations.
Great, thanks, Tassim. Patrick, do you have anything to add to that?
No. I agree with Tassim and Zarina.
Okay, great. So we got 2 more questions. So we're just going to hopefully just take them. So this one is from Arish Yassin. How do you incentivize spending scarce resources on climate change response, especially in developing countries? COVID-19 response requires more urgent support, whereas most climate change impacts are perceived as less urgent or indirect. An example would be to look at the locust swarm in Africa and Asia, and the devastating impact it will have on food security and livelihoods. But since it runs in parallel to COVID-19, disaster response funds and resources are not directed towards tackling it with the same urgency. And this is obviously in the context of the fact that aid is expected to decline because of the economic fallout. So I think maybe I think Senan might have some ideas on that. Senan?
Sorry, Michael, can I kind of like interrupt here? I noticed that we're out of time and we should be heading towards our breakout rooms. So I wonder whether, Senan, you could give a quick response to that, and maybe if we can handle the other questions and maybe take them into the breakout sessions, if that's okay.
I would just say quickly, I think that putting our responses to COVID-19 and climate change into 2 separate boxes is where some of these issues come when trying to finance or incentivize resources for developing countries. It's also, we don't have to conceptualize them like that. We can, if we are tackling the food insecurity caused by COVID-19, we are tackling food insecurity caused by a crisis. Whether that crisis is caused by coronavirus or it's caused by climate change, is immaterial to the need to finance responses to any disruptor to food insecurity. So when I say incentivizing scarce resources, I'd say the response to that is the approach, not necessarily a specific mechanism targeting 2 competing funding or finance routes for this.